Amazing. So it looks like we are live, and I'm sure it'll show up soon on LinkedIn. But I just wanted to welcome everybody today who are joining us for this webinar panel. So today we're just going to be discussing ESG frameworks and that landscape and really how it's changing in a very rapid way. And there's a lot of interesting trends that we're seeing in this space. So thank you all for being here. Surely people will join as we kind of go along. But as you do jump on live, just say hello, introduce yourself, and just feel free to ask questions along the way, because it is really going to be conversational. So we do want to make sure that you're involved in this process. And I'd like to also introduce my panel members here today. We've got Hemant from Zero Circle. And we've got Patrick Beasley, who is from Schneider Electric, and Neil Plummer, who is a climatologist. And we're all here to talk to you about ESG and these frameworks and what's really happening in this space. So yeah, welcome welcome you guys to this panel discussion. I'm really happy to do this with you guys. Maybe you can introduce yourselves and talk a little bit about your roles. I mean, I'm going to present the slide in a bit, but you can talk about your roles in this space. Patrick, maybe you can kick us off.
Sure. Thanks, Meryl. So I'm Patrick Beasley, and I work with Schneider Electric, and I co-lead a team of consultant application engineers around the U.S. And their role is to really help drive, design, systematic, functional design, sustainable design, and smart designs for electrical systems. And we're really pushing our team to become more sustainable in how they're designing these systems with their customers, being a little bit smarter about, not just making something function and be safe, but what else can we do to prepare ourselves for kind of the future of sustainable design and eventually, some of this ESG reporting. So excited to talk about it today.
Amazing. Glad to have you here, Patrick. And Neil, maybe you can introduce yourself as well. Tell us about your work.
Yeah, sure. So I'm a climatologist, former head of climate services in the Australian Bureau of Meteorology. Now I spend a lot of time working with organisations to support them in their management of risks, both from physical climate risks and transition risks. But also look for those opportunities, particularly through the energy transition. So big interest in ESG and disclosures and so forth. Great to be here.
Amazing. And it is all connected, isn't it? So I think we've got all these diverse minds in the room, which is so valuable, I think, in this space. We can never really leave anybody out. Everyone needs to be involved. So yeah, thanks for being here, Neil. And Hemant, I'd love to hear from you as well in your work at Zero Circle.
Thanks, Mara. Yeah, so I'm the founder of Zero Circle. We are an early stage climate fintech startup. Our focus is specifically on enabling the transition of small and mid-sized organizations to get access to green finance and green loans to drive the transition towards a net zero economy. In addition to that, some of those elements involve ESG reporting, emissions reporting, scope 3 reporting. All of those drive, are embedded in a lot of the financial decisions. And so we are building out capabilities to enable specifically small and mid-sized organizations to kind of identify, track, monitor, and report this so that, banks and institutions can use that information as part of their loan and sustainable finance programs.
Yeah, amazing. Thanks so much for sharing that, Hemant. I am just in the background trying to share my screen, but I guess I'll introduce myself and Subsynctus and what we do. I guess we focus really on the ESG space and really building out those frameworks for clients that really helps with the decision making, the way that they really kind of take action within the business and embed those systems to capture the right information and use that to keep driving their sustainability goals. And so it's really important, I think, from our perspective that ESG is tangible, and it is not just tangible, it's clear and transparent, but also that there are easy to follow steps And I think that's often the barrier for many businesses in this space. So that's really what we focus on. So yeah, thank you all again for being here. I am going to start sharing my screen. We've just got a light slideshow in the background to kind of keep us focused on what we're here to talk about. But just let me know as well once you guys can actually see that screen, because it's showing up blank on my end, but sure, it'll pop up soon.
It's showing a blank here
And
as
those
well.
of you, yeah, it's still blank. I guess just a reminder to those who are live, I can see a few of you here on LinkedIn. Feel free to say hello and just introduce yourself as well. This is a space where you can, meet new people and certainly connect with others as well who are in this similar space of work. I think that's what it's all about, is networking and collaborating and working together. And I guess that's why we're all here today as well. We're all from very different spaces of from ESG, from that ESG perspective. So feel free to say hello and connect. And let's see if this sharing works. It looks like it's still not sharing, is it? Yeah, still blank on your end?
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, what I might do, rather than sort of waiting for that to happen, I'm sure I can get that happening in the background. But what's really important is to kind of talk about these ESG frameworks and get into what's sort of happening in this space. So maybe this journey of ESG and how it's really evolved is something that we could kind of explore at this stage, because it hasn't just sort of turned up out of nowhere. It's really been a process of evolution, from looking at efficiency and optimization, and then considering how can businesses also be for purpose while also making profit. And that's where that CSR idea and the corporate social responsibility really came up. Hi Praveen, you're from Bosch, you're in the CSR space. Thanks for being here. And I guess now we've got ESG, which is really, as most people understand it, a way for investors as a stakeholder group to feel safe in what they're seeing happening in the business that they're supporting. But it's much more than that. It's so much more. It's really a tool, in my eyes, to help businesses create a clear, transparent pathway that is also quite technical and has real action items that are measurable, that are verifiable, and that the business is accountable to, especially the leaders. So that's how I see this space. And I guess feel free to kind of add your thoughts as well, Hemant or Patrick or Neil. I'd love to hear what you guys think about the evolution of ESG.
I can go first, right? So maybe, just kind of my thoughts on this is, like you said, it's been an evolution, and I think it's still evolving. I don't think we are in, kind of any final state yet. I think the challenges has been interesting, and the issues that I see at a high level are there's no clear. There are guidelines and there are frameworks, but it's hard to have a uniformity across different reporting standards and different frameworks that, whether I individually as an investor, as a consumer, as a buyer of certain products, can leverage in any meaningful fashion. So I have to have a fairly in-depth knowledge of the specific metrics and specific criteria to make any meaningful sense out of it, right? So there still is an issue around too much complexity in this space. And essentially some organizations cherry picking what's beneficial to them to drive the ESG discussions and kind of the reporting around it to make them look good and make and use the most convenient framework that makes sense for them, right? So I think some of that is being addressed as part of this evolution. But that drives a lot more complexity in how companies and organizations and even consumers, to a certain extent, think about ESG and think about the factors that are involved as part of these organizations' reporting. So, Patrick and Neil, you guys are much more involved in this. What do you see? How do you see these frameworks that your customers are leveraging and your partners are leveraging, and some of the challenges and pros and cons around it?
Well, the big shift in Australia is now with the the government supporting the adoption of the ISSB, the International Sustainability Standards Board, is now it's going to be mandatory for our large companies to disclose according to this standard by the middle of next year. That's coming around very, very quickly. And it has been on the cards for the last 3 years or so forth. Bit of a story with Australia. We went through some, as many people on this webinar would know, a massive bushfire, heat waves back in the 2019-20 summer. Since then, I'd say there's been a far more focus on climate change in Australia. And indeed, the Australian Institute of Company Directors since then has done a whole lot of work in preparing company directors for disclosure on ESG, climate risk management, and so forth. So that's a huge change in a short space of time. And I think, as Hemant said, we had that relatively incremental evolution in Australia up to that point, but things have changed very, very quickly, and that's becoming very, very real for most of our businesses. That's okay. Like a lot of the big businesses have reported on sustainability for some time. This is a shift because it's a more formal approach. There's going to be a lot more eyes watching on what those reports and disclosures look like. But then there's the next level of companies that perhaps have got a lot less experience and expertise in this area that are going to have to do this in the very near future.
Yeah, it's a really good point you're making. It's not going to kind of bypass the smaller companies. It's definitely going to hit them very soon. I mean, it's already come on so quickly, considering how piecemeal the journey has been with Australia. It's incredible, the changes. Patrick, I'd love to hear your thoughts. I mean, you're over in US and New York. You can share your perspective as well.
When it comes to reporting and disclosing, for the most part, it's been state by state, which a lot of things happen in the U.S. Hemant, you've seen this as well. California started it where you had to do certain things in California with Title 24. Then New York did, and even down to the cities. Certain cities are doing certain things, so there's no uniformity yet across the board. And I think that's going to eventually cause a little heartache here, because as the rules and requirements start to broaden, SEC has certain guidelines. But Neil, to your point, as those smaller or larger firms, as you broaden into the US, they don't have the expertise, right? And they don't have the experience of maybe disclosing something when their location's in New York, but maybe not in the Midwest. And so as the requirements start to expand further into the US, more and more companies are going to need more guidance around what exactly do we do, because it's the same scenario. Materiality is vague, right? You kind of decide what makes sense to report, and then you report downstream, you kind of go through the rest, but that has kind of left some vagueness, unfortunately, historically. And now as these other rules start to come into play, it's just, I think the bigger play in the US is going to be those large to medium-sized firms that have never had to do it before, but it's coming quick.
Yeah, I like what you. Oh, sorry, Hemant, were you going to say something?
No, I was just going to add, right, to Patrick's comment. I think the challenge also in the US is that they haven't fully adopted a uniform standard that is global in nature, and so you'll also start to feel somewhat disconnected, because some of the larger corporates, let's say the Metas, the Facebook, the Googles of the world, they are going to adopt global standards because they operate globally, right? And so they're going to leverage the standards that are in Australia, that are in Europe, that are have been much more mandated and regulated through government agencies, and essentially potentially even force that in the US because they can maintain some level of uniformity.
Yeah.
But we are not getting direct government mandates to do some of these reporting and identify some of the reporting standards today. So that's where there's going to be some level of disconnect within the US, where we don't know where we stand just yet, whether US is going to kind of create their own reporting frameworks and guidelines, or whether we adopt the international standards that are being driven primarily out of Europe and pushed into some of Asia and Australia accordingly, right? So this is going to be some things we'll kind of have to monitor, and again, it might within the next 6 months, 12 months, things might change again. We have no idea how this is going.
Yeah, and I think just added to both your points, really, I think for me anyways, whenever I talk to clients, it's really about how do we set up some systems, some fundamental foundational systems that are already thinking in alignment with the international standards, because I always go by ISSB and they're all kind of consolidating under ISSB, GRI, SASB, the value reporting framework, all of that. So it's about aligning with something that is already kind of the beacon and really going to be that consolidated framework that we're all going to be moving towards. So if your business is kind of putting in those systems in place early on, then regardless of what your country does at its own individual level, you already have very key systems in place. That will certainly align, because I doubt that any country, including the US, could really create their own entirely different system. It will still have very close alignment to ISSB and the kind of respective frameworks. So yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting to see what's happening in this space. And I think we've got Michael Davidson, who's just introduced himself. So he is he guides firms, he guides innovative firms in the ag tech sector to identify funding and help them penetrate the US and global South markets. Thanks for joining us, Michael. Appreciate you being here. I guess today what we're really wanting to cover is ESG frameworks, the essentials, which we've pretty much talked about. But just looking at the consolidation and the trends and what's really happening in this space, what are the pros and cons to the changing environment and in terms of what's happening, and then how to prepare your organization and how to support your organization as well. So what's that, that journey really look like? I've already really introduced Subsynctis, and we've introduced ourselves as well. But yeah, just to remind you again who we've got on the panel, we've got Hemant Sethi, who is in the climate fintech sustainability space and runs Zero Circle. As myself, Meryl Sukumar, founder of Subsynctis Consulting. We've got Patrick Beasley from Schneider Electric, who is their regional specifier manager, and Neil Plummer, who is a climatologist and risk specialist. So we've got a really diverse range of minds here contributing to this discussion. So feel free to ask any questions as well along the way. But I guess, we have really kind of covered this topic. So I will this particular slide, but I guess I'll really just touch on one point, and you guys can obviously add your thoughts as well. But right now there is over 600 ESG frameworks out there. So there is a lot out there. It's a very kind of complex is not even really the word. It's kind of a confused environment. It's probably quite convoluted as well. And so navigating that is really challenging for businesses, especially if you're a smaller business, because often the biggest barrier aside from money and time is also the fact that time was the one that I wanted to focus on. So aside from money, it's that time spent to actually sift through all of the noise and find what is the best pathway for your business to move forward on. So it is really kind of complex at the moment, and I guess this is our job, is to help kind of simplify this journey for clients out there and businesses out there. So it'd be great to hear you guys and your thoughts around this and what's kind of there at the moment in the ESG framework space.
Yeah, I had one, I guess, a question for both Patrick and Neil, right? So, there is obviously there's more global standards and frameworks, GRI, SASB, ISSB, etc. But there's also more industry-specific frameworks and things like that, right? So, Patrick, you're in kind of the electrical and electronic space, so there could be things that are relevant within that, right? So, how do you think about connecting more industry-specific, frameworks or even regional frameworks back to the global? Like, how do you see that, kind of happening today, and kind of at high level, where do you guys see it going, tomorrow?
Yeah, I mean, I could start when it comes to. I could speak to the manufacturing space in general. That's kind of where Schneider fits. For us, a big piece of reporting out is embodied carbon, right? I mean, that's one of the biggest things that our customers are going to want from us, is right, how much carbon, like what's that impact of, if I design this way, what's my carbon impact, right? Because it's not just as the building is operational, right? That embodied carbon is, I forget what the metric I saw most recently, about 49% they're estimating is that embodied carbon of a new building is roughly 49 or even 50% of the total carbon impact of that building in its lifetime, which is significant. So more and more companies need to develop those EPDs or PEP documents to be able to give their customers that power of understanding, here's one way to design it. Maybe here's a slightly more carbon friendly way to design it, because that is going to be something that your customers care about. And when you're talking about the built environment, because that's really where my specialty comes from, is you've got so many stakeholders before that end user, before that end investor, right? That each one of them needs to be educated in a simple way, right? Here's the embodied carbon of this piece, and so on and so forth. And I think from the manufacturing space, that's a big piece of it. But we're also hearing, and Meryl, you kind of hinted at this a little bit, is those smaller to medium sized, even some of the larger, if you will, firms or companies need a way to understand, company disclosures in a simplified manner. If they look at, say, the Schneider's sustainability report out, right, it's going to go over their head. So there's got to be a way to simplify that, and I think the UN SDGs is a great way to kind of simplify what are some of the high level things companies are doing. But I think you said it, you kind of hit the nail on the head. Everything needs to be a little bit simplified for some of these firms. And, I'm trying to do that with some of my work here at Schneider, simplifying what is the embodied carbon aspect, because that's a big ticket item for us, for our customers.
Yeah, definitely. And it's really good to see as well that they're looking at their embodied carbon rather than just waiting for the design to be done or built and then look at operational efficiency. And
that's what we're trying to push, because historically it was never there, right? You wanted to make the building work, right? You want the building to be efficient, but the carbon piece is kind of, efficient is great because that lowers the overall usage of the building, right? And your overall use, during operations, carbon impact goes down. But it's what does it take to build it? That piece is now becoming, I think LEED posted something where is almost equal 50-50 operational to build in terms of the overall, converted carbon impact. Yeah, which was incredible to read. I never would have expected it to be almost 50-50. So definitely becoming a big item in my space, at least. So
yeah, it's a huge impact.
From myself,
and also I just wanted to touch on the acronym you used earlier, EPD, which is Environmental Product Declaration. And so that's really a way for businesses to kind of assess their environmental impact of that specific product or that specific system, I guess, and what is the environmental impact. So there's real clarity, transparency, and then it gives them a baseline to kind of springboard off of what they will do now moving forward to obviously ensure the lower climate impact, lower ecological impact of that product. And sorry, Neil, I did cut you off, but I wanted to just clarify. There's too many acronyms in this space.
Well, we do need an acronym police officer on the beat. So I'm glad you've taken on that role, Meryl. I was just going to say similar to Patrick, because what he mentioned about simplifying things, it resonated with me, because a survey that was done, it was probably 18 months ago now, of Australian company directors to find what their biggest challenge in this space was, and they rated not knowing where to start as the number one challenge, which, when you think about it, it's pretty profound. Like for a business that is undoubtedly going to face all these challenges, but have these opportunities too. So my angle into it is, well, all organizations, no matter small, medium, or large, need to manage risks, right? Good organizations need to do that. They're all out there seeking opportunities. They preferably they're not having to deal with all the climate change, the energy transition, and sort of separate in a sort of standoff way compared to their business, having things integrated. And for me, it was like the TCFD brought those things together for me. That's the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures.
Yeah,
That strategy.
you got in there quickly.
I did, yeah. Bringing together that, the strategy and the governance, and all organizations, no matter how big, need to be good on those things. So I guess that's my piece on this.
Yeah, and it sort of leads well into the next slide, which is really around, what's sort of happening with these frameworks, because it is complicated. So how is it already being simplified at that higher level, which is probably around those consolidation trends? But we will also touch on this later on about how can a business really just get started, where Neil touched on risk. And Hemant, I think you were going to contribute some thoughts and I cut you off. So please feel free to share.
Yeah, so I think I kind of had more question for both of you guys, Neil and Patrick, right? In the sense that at the end of the day, there is going to be a supply chain element to some of this reporting, right? And so, where your customers are working with their suppliers to, like in Patrick, your example, identify the embodied carbon associated with a particular component or a part or whatever, right? So how are you seeing some of the smaller players just doing baseline reporting on this, right? Is it very much guided through, your expertise and kind of hand-holding them along the way? Are there specific things and, systems and platforms and, services in the industry that currently enable that for these smaller players? I mean, what are you guys seeing generally in that space?
Yeah, I mean, I think for the most part, from my perspective, when you're looking at smaller customers, they tend to come to us. Schneider has an immense network of sustainability consultants and ESG consultants that we have on staff that work with customers. I mean, there's a million different frameworks you can use or softwares you can use to kind of build out a simplified reporting, if you can say it's simplified, right? I'd say majority of them, if they're required to, again, kind of it's piecemeal, I'd say, throughout the US of who's actually needing to report and when, right? Most of them, I think, are either coming to us or they're coming to, your Accentures and other companies like that have people on staff that understand ISSB, which is kind of like, I think you had said, is kind of a baseline, right? And they're guiding them to some of these software tools that they can simply input information, the data that they've got, and it outputs some form of a report for them. That seems to be what I'm hearing is kind of, there's, especially if they want to, if it's not a requirement, they're just trying to figure something out. That's the path they're taking, right? Trying to get comfortable with doing some sort of reporting, kind of leading up to a potential, hey, here's what you must do. At least they've got a baseline. So that's kind of what I've seen, kind of from a peripheral, if you will. But curious, Neil, what are you seeing in your world?
Yeah, it was interesting. It takes my mind back. A couple of years when we had interest from a small food manufacturer in southeastern Australia around wanting to know more about climate risk and how to deal with things. And it was odd, and we talked about this and then realized that they were coming to us probably because one of the big, at least one of the big food retailers in Australia was putting pressure on them. They were and the ones I have in mind were already big in terms of sustainability reporting and so forth. So this was, to me, was a great example of this pushing through the supply chain, which is why the work that we decided to do was to focus on the small to medium size enterprises, because this is the big companies will probably be well served by the big consultancy companies in Australia. The real gap will be these small organizations, and as I said before, that really just don't know where to start. Nor can they afford a process that's going to take 2 to 3 months, when that is probably double or triple the time they spent on updating their overall strategy, of which this is only a component of. So there's a big mismatch here. So I see there is a real gap here, and it's going to emerge quite quickly in the market about how do we get a more simplified, streamlined approach to help those organizations, because one doesn't exist right now.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's a really, really fair point, and it's something that I know that I haven't been focusing on as much, but it's something I realize it keeps sort of tugging on me, that we really do need to support the SMEs, because they certainly it's complex and they don't know where to start. And if I know when I first started in this space, just kind of looking at it, it's so overwhelming. And when you kind of think about the fact that ESG is also already kind of quite well established. It exists in 38 of the world's top economies, and so it is well established and really well integrated into sort of the bigger corporates. So the smaller guys kind of have a lot of catching up to do, and it's overwhelming, I guess, to say the least.
Yeah.
And in terms of what's happening in this space, just to sort of lean into that, is we've talked about the ISSB quite a bit, which is the International Sustainability Standards Board, and they've really been commissioned by the IFRS, which is the International Financial Reporting Strategies, around consolidating and sort of in some way absorbing the frameworks or design principles or the principles of thinking from the other standards. So GRI, SASB, all of TCFD, consolidating those into what ISSB is doing. That way there is kind of a unified system of thinking. And there's both pros and cons to this, but overall, I think it's a really positive thing that's happening at the moment in this space. And what we're seeing in terms of sort of trends around ESG reporting is, this big focus on ethics and integrity. So, really kind of a purposeful and ethical business. And as well as looking at supply chain, which is often a very neglected part of business operations, but looking at that supply chain security and resilience, because as Patrick mentioned, Neil also touched on, is these smaller businesses are receiving that pressure from their supply chain, from the bigger guys about, are you doing this? Are you considering your materiality? Are you looking at your impact as a operations and so on? So there's a real priority around supply chain resilience and essentially getting the workforce to transition, because the economy is going to change. The way that we view business, the way that we view economics, the way that we work and operate, typical kind of jobs that are available in the market are going to change. This new economy is kind of really transitioning quickly into one that's more sustainable, that looks at jobs that are less about just kind of linear consumerism, right? It's really kind of changing from that linear model. And so that's a really wonderful trend to see, as well as this kind of inclusion. In Australia, this is particularly important, but inclusion of First Nations and empowering them as well, because speaking just from my perspective as an Australian, it's so important to lean in on our First Nations, which is the Aboriginals and the Torres Strait Islanders as well, in terms of leaning in on their learnings and knowledge of country. It's so valuable because they are so connected with the natural ecosystem and understanding nature, which is intrinsically circular, is intrinsically sustainable. So leaning in on that and empowering them as well into this journey is so great to see as a trend in the ESG space. But yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts on all of this. And I guess, the First Nations thing is also important in so many parts of the world. I just wanted to touch on what it means here in Australia.
Yeah, I'll just give that example, an example here in southeastern Australia, where I see there are some organisations, particularly in the water sector, that are really, in terms of engagement with traditional owners, are really taking that next step. And the next step is, in terms of governance, is getting Indigenous people onto their boards. Going a step beyond just consulting with traditional owners, but involving them directly in their high level decision making. On the broader issue here, like the next probably year or two is going to be very much focused for organizations on compliance side, I think. And ensuring that they know how to report against these standards that are coming in, and hopefully a quick shift there to organizations recognizing the enormous opportunities that are available. And I know some organizations are further down the path with that. But then I think another revolution is around differentiating further with this, which is actually, because you look at this report and it's very organization by organization based. You focus on your organization, you are looking at your supply chains and so forth. But those companies that really bring to life their ESG engagement by the way they influence others outside of the organization, by the way they support organizations in their supply chains. Because let's face it, you can have, in terms of the challenges we've got ahead, particularly with climate change, the organization can get an A+ grade in terms of its ESG reporting, but find that if others around them aren't doing their bit, then the impact is very, very diluted. So I think that's a differentiating piece. Those organizations that go beyond the compliance, beyond looking at the internal opportunities here, how they influence others and how they support others to do ESG better.
I think that's really powerful. And Meryl, I think you mentioned something about, the big players kind of telling their value chain what they need to do. I think that kind of leans into that, Neil, is if you're if you're doing this big reporting, if you're an extra large, multinational company, you want your suppliers, your upstream and your downstream to be reporting out. You kind of have to help them, right? Because you're going to have that know-how, that knowledge, that experience. It's up to you to kind of hold their hand a little bit for these first few months or years and say, hey, here's what we've been doing. Here's what I need from you. And here's where you can go get it. In long term, they're going to have to do it themselves. But I really think a lot of the big folks, I know at Schneider, they do it. They really work with downstream and upstream to say, hey, here's what we need from you. Here's how, you're going to help us and we're going to help you, achieve these goals. And I think that's really powerful. So for a lot of these bigger multinational companies that are taking these initial steps, they really have to help those smaller and medium folks that they're working with to try to align and kind of give them that little leg up in the beginning, So yeah, it's really powerful. Yeah,
I was going to ask you the kind of a question around that, right? There's two pieces to it. How much is a carrot and a stick approach, right? How much do you kind of pressure versus how much do you drive, engagement and opportunities? And secondly, what is the incentive, right? In the sense that the cost for being sustainable is still pretty high today, right? If some of the parts, if you're truly sustainable manufacturer, sustainable kind of, reduced carbon produce products, they can be 5-10 times more expensive than something that's produced today. Now eventually it will come down, eventually those things will normalize, but there's going to be a transition period. And when profitability is one of the biggest issues today, especially in this inflation economy, how do you prioritize sustainability initiatives and products into the supply chain? I guess how are you seeing companies engage now? Schneider is a big enough company, they have the margins to drive that at the corporate level, but how do you potentially drive that down the supply chain and some of the smaller players? Kind of what have you seen as strategies and tactics that companies engage here today?
Well, I mean, Neil, you may have more experience in this than I do. I mean, mine's kind of laser focused, but my perspective is when you look at it's twofold, right? Schneider wants, companies like Schneider, I don't speak solely for them, but they want to be more sustainable. They want their products to be, and Schneider is depending on what publication you read, one of the top 5, if not the top sustainable company in the world. And they do that by, that being their focus and a proven track record that we can be sustainable, we can make these changes, we can make these bold moves. And as an investor, your return on investment is worth it. We continue to sell, we continue to grow, our market share continues to increase, our focus, we've, and again, I don't want to go into a Schneider pitch here, but they focused on sustainability and kind of are starting to build the business around it. And that has driven, a positive impact at the shareholder level. And when you look at other companies and just, I forget the numbers, I'm not going to, know them verbatim, but when you look at the companies that are in the top tier of, listed sustainable companies, and, they've gone through some checks and balances to say, what makes them sustainable, they tend to have higher or on the higher end of returns versus other companies. And so you're going to get investors that are going to support that because they know they're going to get those returns. So you're going to get the investor support there. And I think that drives a lot of it, from a public company perspective. But I mean, from Schneider side, they really want to do it because they've seen the success. So they're going to drive that success more and more and more with their suppliers, especially the suppliers. So that's my perspective. Neil, I'm curious what you've seen with some of the you've worked with.
Yeah, well, I agree with what you've said there, Patrick. 100%. I think on the pressure versus the support side of things, I think the sustained pressure put on across the supply chain will only go so far. And I think the companies that will thrive will be those that increasingly see collaboration and partnerships here, because we'll look at right now here we're looking at really an expanding pie in terms of the opportunities there. So it is not a this isn't constrained.
Oh, sorry, Neil, you've muted yourself.
Sorry. Even the large organizations, the benefits that they will gain from learning from others within, let's say, an ecosystem here, outweigh what they can get by competing against other organizations. Because there's always those organizations that have been down the path before, that have tried different things, that are further down the learning curve, that have reduced costs through testing different ways of doing things. So I think the ESG brings forth a new era of greater collaboration, greater partnerships. When you put both your feet into doing those things, you create greater trust. That's one of the key benefits for an organization, to have that trust with its stakeholders. So I do, as I said before, those companies that can differentiate, those companies that are really good at working with other companies, not out of self-interest, but out of building trust and giving support, I think they're going to be the winners over the next 5, 10 years. So being good at ESG is going to be really helpful in that regard.
And just to add on something you said there, because it kind of stuck with me. The trust and the disclosure is going to be very critical, because you said something that's very important, is there's only so far certain companies can go, right, when it comes to decarbonizing. I mean, at some point, you have to burn something, right, to make concrete and steel, and those industries, you're never going to get to zero, right? You're never going to get to that point. But being truthful and honest and disclosing all of that, I mean, that's all that we can do, and that's what we have to do, is saying, here's what we've done, here's as good as we're going to get right now, right? Maybe future technologies change that, but just having that trust, like you said, about how far we can get, or how far each company can get, is going to be really important. Yeah, you hit it there for sure.
Definitely. You both really did. And it's a great question, Hemant. But it really just sort of shows like purposeful business is really the way that is the way forward, because purposeful businesses, or businesses with that kind of conscious intention, are the ones that are going to really thrive. But I think even in a sort of more practical way as well, I mean, trust is super important, but also to see it from another perspective, there is obviously what Patrick said, there's that cost efficiency that you see in your business, but you also see a improvement of resilience in your whole supply chain, not just your business operations when you're working with your supply chain and when you're collaborating, but you also reduce the risk profile. So those are really key things. And along the way, you bring people on the journey, and so you build that reputational sort of support, recognition as well from your community and your stakeholders and that sort of thing. So it's super valuable from so many perspectives. And I guess, I wanted to just lead into the next slide as well, about what's really happening in this space, and what are the consolidation trends that are being seen. I mean, Hemant, maybe you can tell us a little bit about this.
Yeah, so I don't know if all of you have seen this picture floating around on the internet, but it's an interesting view of how some of the big standards are essentially consolidating into the ISSB, right? And basically, the way I look at ISSB, and hopefully it's not a utopian state, but I look at it as, kind of the Lord of the Rings metaphor, right? Wanting to rule them all type of thing, where you got disclosures, climate risk, scope 3 emissions, all of that into one, big old standard, right? The one thing that is promising to see is it is owned by the IFRS, which essentially is the kind of owner of the gap standard, which pretty much every company in the world uses, right? So the fact that they have credibility in adopting the gap reporting standards for accounting and for profitability across organizations and global corporations, it is promising to see that now they're basically creating, reinventing the same construct under the ESG domain, under the ISSB umbrella, right? And so one of the couple of things that they've initially started off with these S1 and S2 disclosures, which is first is on the general sustainability related disclosures, which if you're doing GRI, you already have, pretty much 80 to 90% of that done around the S1. And then secondly, around the climate risk disclosures, which if you're doing TCFD, you're already kind of meeting some of those requirements, right? And I believe some of the things that are pending is around the scope 3 emissions in the supply chain side, which I believe is going to come relatively soon. And that essentially brings all these standards under one reporting guidelines, reporting framework, and allows organizations to start ignoring the noise and reducing, like Mary said earlier, like 600 reporting standards down to hopefully less than 600, 200, 300, who knows, but something along those lines, right? So having said that, Patrick, Neil, right, from the companies that you work with, and even within your own organization, are you seeing this trend to kind of move towards ISSB, and how are companies starting to think about hopefully this more simplified reporting guideline as the kind of the next wave. Now, Neil, you kind of alluded to that a little earlier, that in Australia they're already kind of mandating from the top down, which is good news. But Patrick, I think you have a little bit more of a diverse customer base, US, Europe, etc. How are you seeing some of the adoption within this framework and regulatory space going on right now?
Yeah. Excuse me. I mean, I think.
Go ahead, Neil.
Yeah, Neil, if you want to go first, yeah.
Yeah, sure. And that so this is going to happen. Like it in Australia, introduced through legislation, through the Corporations Act. I think it's July 2024, which means that work for those companies that have to report then, and it really is the big companies then. They're starting now, but many of them have started earlier. That will happen. They'll be investing. They'll be gearing up for that. Then the next lot of companies, it'll be July 2025, and then the third lot will be July 2026. So even the 2026 need to actually start preparing that now. But there is I think there's an easier way to move into this. And in Australia, we've actually prioritized the IFRS S2 for climate-related disclosures, which is smaller in scope, and it's one that most companies have probably have more experience in doing. There are a sort of a holding back from the big penalties for companies that fall foul of this for about 3 years, I think. So in a way, there's an easing into this. As I said earlier, there is a piece for a lot of companies, work for a lot of companies here, to get them doing this in a very simplified, in a simplified way, because the long route, and this is where I think most companies need to get to, is to things like bring scenario analysis into identifying your risks and opportunities. But that's not going to happen for a lot of the small size for a long way. But how can they be eased into this as opposed to go through a full week exercise of having to do these things? And we've experimented a bit with how we can actually how we can do that, and I think it is doable. And I think it's going to be necessary for those SMEs.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Patrick, did you want to share any thoughts as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think it'll happen organically, that the transition to the ISSB, the new IFRS standards. The SEC tried to come out with some stuff that kind of aligned with TCFD, and it kind of does. But as ISSB kind of is now, as you said, the one ring to rule them all, right? Ultimately, organically, everything will funnel towards that. And I think you absolutely hit it with the fact that it's developed by and supported by the same group that created and runs GAP. Companies and whether it's cities, states, or countries are going to align with that, because that is it is a proven standard. Obviously, the organization has proven success, so why not align with that? And I think there will be companies that will do non-IFRS reporting, right, where they report on that, but then they're going to report something else, just like non-GAAP reporting. A lot of financial statements have non-GAAP, right, because it's important enough that they should disclose it. They want to, right, but they're all going to align that way, because I think that framework of we must report this if we want to, we kind of have free reign, hit pretty heavily, I think, with a lot of companies. Plus, it'll be easy from an auditing perspective, right? They know how GAAP gets audited, right? The reporting is going to be audited in that way. Well, hey, so will the ISSB, right? It's from the same organization, so the audit process will be very similar. It's something they're comfortable with. So I think it's just going to be organic. Unfortunately, the alphabet soup that's on the screen right now, people have been using different variations of it. And so it's just going to have to happen organically, the transition to the ISSB and the new IFRS S1 and S2. So it's just going to take a little bit of time, I think. But ultimately, I think everyone will transition to that.
And I like your approach, right? You have the GAAP and the non-GAAP standards, right? And
definitely. And sorry, Patrick, I just sort of seem to be breaking up a little bit in between. Okay, hopefully I didn't cut you off. I just was breaking up a little bit for me.
Okay.
But I guess I just wanted to touch on what are the pros and the cons of these changes that we're seeing. Sorry, Hemant, did you say something?
Yeah, I think we were kind of disconnected a bit, right? So what I was going to say was, what Patrick mentioned about the GAAP and the non-GAAP standard. The fact that we do have something like the GAAP standard, you can now easily, benchmark and rank and rate companies based on the fact that everybody's has some level of uniform reporting, right? There's a baseline that every company follows, and today we don't have that baseline in ESG. And it's one of the big issues around, greenwashing and, claims made, because that baseline is not consistent across reporting standards, across different disclosures, across different company ratings and things like that, right? So having a uniform standard like this and a baseline like this will essentially allow a lot more, predictive comparison between organizations using similar data rather than, compromised data sets that, make it weird in terms of why these ratings don't align with what companies' processes and policies and disclosures look like, right? So it kind of touches upon the pro and con, but that was an apt comparison around, what GAAP is currently doing today and how we can benchmark and create portfolios around that. Because of that, eventually will lead us to do the same thing with ISSB and the baseline around ISSB reporting guidelines and frameworks.
Yeah. And so it's obvious that there's pros and cons, but primarily more pros to this process. And I guess, look, it still comes back to the question then, how do we help organizations, especially the smaller ones, to take action, and how do they get prepared as an organization? So, I think it really starts with that underlying foundation, which is the sustainable development goals are sort of the best way to get started, is to think about, what is the goals that your business really impacts or contributes to, and how can you change, the bad impact, the negative impact, and how can you obviously level up the positive impact? Where does your business want to go in that future? And so starting with the SDGs is a really valuable point. And then, of course, now seeing where these ESG frameworks are moving towards, understanding the ISSB and at least putting in some foundational systems in place can really help. And I think I might just go into that next slide just because of time, to really say that where businesses can start is, starting to look at their material impacts and doing that initial materiality assessment, which means speaking to your stakeholders, understanding what it is they face from their perspective in terms of interacting with your business. Maybe it's through operations or supply chain or managing or leading the business. So, what is it that they face? And that will really get you started. There's obviously more steps from that, but getting started on that materiality can really help you know where is the impact in your business. Tribute to that, because I think it's really coming back to this question of what can businesses do to kickstart this journey? What's that first step?
Yeah, I think you said something.
If any of you want to share your thoughts, feel free.
I think your point about, using SDGs is, if you're coming into this blind and brand new, just looking at the SDGs and thinking, hey, where does my company fit into these? I think that's a great way to start. To say, hey, what do we impact? What could we even impact? What impacts us from these SDGs? And then kind of using that as maybe your baseline for material review is, all right, here's the SDGs we kind of fit in with. Now let's look at our company and our stakeholders, and what are the material things that we can think about reporting out on and are meaningful. But I like that point there, Meryl. That's a good point of where to start.
Yeah, great point, Meryl, and that's a terrific slide, zooming in on those material issues. Your top 3 or 4 risks, your top 3 or 4 opportunities, and just using them as a learning exercise to drill down. Well, what does the organization need to do to mitigate those risks and to benefit from those opportunities? The only thing I would add to that is sort of inform yourself. In organizations, find a way of just bridging that knowledge gap early on. There's a lot of material out there. There's not a lot of people that can help with do that, just to make that barrier to where to get started just a little lower.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for sharing those thoughts. And I guess it sort of leads in to how we're helping organizations. And Hemant, maybe you can share your thoughts on this particular slide, but what we're doing to support organizations with level 0, level 1 assessments that are low cost. So there's that low barrier to entry, but it gives you a key understanding of the material impacts as a business. So Hemant, I'll pass it over to you to talk about this one.
Yeah, so in the interest of time, it's a very high-level view, but what we can do is get you started, as Meryl and Neil and Patrick mentioned, right? We have a platform to allow organizations to start building out what their sustainability profiles look like and their goals and factors using SDGs, GRI, and SASB currently, and we are in the process of exploring ISSB as well. So the real objective of this is to get to what we call a level 1 profile that allows you to communicate your sustainability to your stakeholders, whether that's your customers, your shareholders, your buyers, your internal team members, etc., and use that to drive stakeholder decisions and road mapping going forward, right? So that's kind of the sustainability assessment report we can create today, and definitely reach out to Meryl or myself, and we can help you get started on that.
Yeah, definitely. And look, and as you can see as well in this image, it also touches on the SDGs, just because they're so fundamental to all of this. I mean, you've got, almost 200 countries or more now maybe who have signed up to the Paris Agreement that ratified these like the Paris Agreement, of course, and the development of these SDGs. So they're just really fundamental to this entire space. And which is why we're trying to make it simple for businesses, not only with a low cost to entry, but also a clear idea of what is their material impacts, and then how does that, I guess, navigate them into that next step, and how does it drive that next step essentially. So yeah, definitely reach out. I know we're on time now, so I do want to thank all of you for joining us live, and those who jumped on and off throughout that. Hopefully you can catch this as a replay. I've got that link available on YouTube. I'll share that as well on here. But I just wanted to thank all of you as well, our panel members here today. Hemant and I are really pleased to have you on here to talk about this important topic, and we really value your contribution as well. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks, Neil. Thanks, Patrick.
Discussion.
Thank you, guys. I really appreciate your time today.
Yeah, appreciate it. Definitely. So, look, I want to thank everyone who joined us live, and if you have any questions or any thoughts, feel free to share those. And as I said, I'll share the link to the replay, which will be available on YouTube for you to watch at in your own time. So thank you, everyone. Take care and goodbye.